It's Conduit News Radio with Paul Harrell.
All right, folks, hey, welcome to the program. Thanks so much for being with us today. We have this headline here, in hour number 2, by the way. Headline over at Fox News, an opinion piece by Mr. Daniel Turner. France yellow vest protests should be a lesson for green activists in the United States. A city on fire, he writes. Cars burnt to ashes, a national monument defaced, 10,000 tear gas canisters and stun grenades used against protesters. In 1 week, Paris transformed from the city of lights into a battle zone. It's important to understand how we got here, he writes. Daniel Turner from Power of the Future actually joins us on the phone. Daniel, welcome back to the program, sir.
Paul, thank you for having me on again.
Yes, sir. So tell us, how did we get here? How did France arrive at the place it's at right now?
Yeah, and I appreciate you reading my op-ed that was on Fox News, and it's actually escalated even since then. They are on 5 weeks now of protests in France, and it really started because their president, Emmanuel Macron, pushed through a new series of carbon taxes, all in the name of climate change, and that was the point of the op-ed. Gas, oil is already very expensive in France because they are not producers. They have to import everything. And added on top of that was an enormous punitive tax that was raising the cost of gas to roughly $7 a gallon for the average French citizen. And again, this was a tax put on because Macron said, we as Frenchmen need to lead the charge in fighting climate change. And we're going to do that by, scratch your head, punishing the people of France. And so a number of Parisians and men and women of France took to the streets and said, why does our president hate us? Why are you punishing us because of the sins of China and India and Malaysia and the countries that do pollute? Why are we having to suffer the consequence? And this is what green activism is, and this is what people like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez want to bring to America.
You know, it's interesting you say this is something that green activists in the U.S. can learn a lesson from. Now, we don't necessarily have a yellow vests, mandated to be stored in our cars. So I don't know what Americans would protest in, but what can we learn, or what can green activists here in America learn from what's happening over in, what's supposed to be progressive Europe?
Exactly. Yeah, I think they could learn that there isn't a national appetite in the United States for sure, and in France in general, and in most of the first world nations, but this is not the way to go to advancing their belief in climate change. You can say what you want about your belief in climate change and whether or not mankind is contributing it due to his lifestyle, but the solution cannot be punishing men and women who are just trying to drive their kids to school, trying to commute to work. And it's funny that the green activists and who lead these charges, I've mentioned Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and people like Tom Steyer and Mike Bloomberg, who fund a lot of the green activism here in America. You just have to look at their private life and ask them if in their private life they will ever live voluntarily the type of mandates that they want government pushed on the rest of us. Bernie Sanders has 3 houses. I don't begrudge him that. I wish I had 3 houses. I don't even own one. These are people who fly on private jets. These are people who jet set around the world. One of the greatest Hollywood advancers of climate change is Leonardo DiCaprio. And again, you don't just need to pick up a copy of People magazine to see the $500,000 a week private yacht he charters in the Caribbean. I'm not begrudging them this lifestyle. I think it's wonderful that they have been so blessed that they can afford to do these things. But they do not live in their private life what they want the rest of us mandated by government to live. And that's why I started this organization, for reasons like that.
Yeah, sometimes I wonder if this is, they feel the need, like Leonardo DiCaprio. I don't know if he really believes this stuff. I think maybe I think it's more like a tithe. I think he has to tithe his opinion, to the people that feed him, meaning the big studios and everything else. I really do think that's a possibility. I have no evidence to back it up, but it's just a thought. But if you really believe this stuff, you wouldn't, you just simply wouldn't be using the amount of fossil fuels that you're using, period,
Exactly. The Daily Caller newspaper publication put out about 2 weeks ago an article. They had looked at all of Bernie Sanders' filings for campaign purposes, and in the last month before the midterms, he had spent over $300,000 of campaign funds on private jets. Totally legal, totally compliant. He filed the paperwork like as required. People write checks to BernieSanders.com, and he can use the money for these purposes. But here is a man who is pushing radical green policies in America, who spent $300,000 in 1 month on private jets. Why couldn't he fly commercial like the rest of us? Even more so, if he really believed in the evils of fossil fuel, why wouldn't he ride horseback to some of these campaigns or walk? Right? So again, it's in their personal life. They never live what they want government forced on the rest of us. France riots for 5 weeks now is proof of that. And so if these green activists, now that they have the House starting in January, if they try to push these policies, they're going to see a huge backlash. Let us hope it is never a violent one. But
Yes.
Americans have had violent protests when they taxed our tea and our paper. Granted, it was 250 years ago, but we have had a history of violent protest when taxes become absurd. It is in our DNA, and we have to hope it doesn't come to that.
I agree with that. We're talking Daniel Turner, the director of Power of the Future. You write in your piece over at foxnews.com, the French people, especially rural citizens, who have no choice but to drive for their livelihoods, were predictably furious. Discontent with Macron had been growing for other reasons, both cultural and economic, but these environmentalist gas taxes were the straw that broke the camel's back. One French citizen expressed his frustration by explaining to the Washington Post, "We live on the side of a mountain. There's no bus or train to take us anywhere. We have to have a car." Now, Daniel, I want to ask you, because back when President Obama was in office, one of his infrastructure plans had to do with, bringing back or bringing high-speed rail and to this country, and we need to be using trains, and there are still some people out there that say that this is the future. We need to be using trains, and most Americans, and apparently Frenchmen, they think that's a regression. I mean, I don't want to have to get on a train. Personally, I live in Arkansas for a reason. I like to be able to get in my car and go where I want to go.
Exactly, and America is changing demographically. That more people are moving into the cities. And that scale of that balance of power is starting to change, which is unfortunate. I am an urban kid. I was born in New York City. I live in D.C., but now because of this job, I spend the vast majority of my time in rural America, and it is different. They don't have, high-speed trains, buses, Amtrak. So people like, again, Miss Cortez, who takes the subway, and you take the subway to the Amtrak. You take the Amtrak down to D.C. where you need to go, and they say, well, why would you need a car? But that is not, and it hasn't historically been how the majority of Americans live. They live in rural communities where your car is just essential to your way of life. It's not a luxury. It's just an essential means of survival. Again, it is funny that people who push these types of taxes always or neglect to take into account the people in rural America, the people who they don't see, and quite frankly, the people who produce our food, work in our energy, do most of our manufacturing, quite honestly, fight most of our wars. Most of America's backbone is in rural America.
Yes.
And yet these are the people who will suffer the most from these types of taxes.
Let me ask you this. The people like the Bernie Sanders, the climate activists, the Sierra Club folks, what has been their reaction to what's been going on in France for the last 5 weeks?
Absolute silence, as has been most of the mainstream media. Just absolute silence. Pretend it's not happening.
And why do you think that is?
I mean, it's got to be because of the actual reason why, the very depth of why these protests are happening. This would shatter their agenda if it were a commonly understood belief that France has been in riots for 5 weeks because of failed green policies. It would make people scratch their head and wonder, boy, what are they doing in our own country along this line, right? So in order to just maintain their agenda and try to convince people that all are on board with green climate change policies, they will just refuse to show it. They refuse to show it in the news. And these groups, like the Sierra Club and Greenpeace, just don't even talk about them. In the last ballot election, there were a number of state-level referendums on climate change issues. 5 out of 6 of them lost. 1 passed, unfortunately, but 5 lost, and lost dramatically on the state level. People are not ready for these types of policies because they also believe that it's not going to do anything to help, quote-unquote, what's going on in the climate change debate. People are not willing to be sacrificed at the altar of climate change just yet. And thank God people are fighting back.
Daniel Turner, we appreciate it, sir. Director of Power the Future, and it's a nonprofit organization. You can find out more at powerthefuture.com. Daniel, it's always great to have you on, sir.
It is always a pleasure. Thank you so much, and Merry Christmas to you.
All right, Merry Christmas to you.